we would avoid the extreme of papal jurisdiction over the state, on the one hand, and of veracity and supremacy over the church, on the other. Each ought to be best qualified for managing its own distinctive and peculiar department, the church for exercising the keys, and the state for wielding the sword. It would not be more incongruous than incompatible to see the secular authorities administering word, sacrament, and censures. The keys have been committed to church officers, and they are not at liberty to surrender them at pleasure. They are only servants in their master's house, and bound faithfully to defend it in his absence. They are not at liberty to throw it open to every intruder, to allow strangers to enter and take possession, to assume the administration and supersede the authority and freedom of his own servants. They are not at liberty to transfer their services to another master, to act under his direction, unless they mean to become the servants of another. They are not at liberty to alienate their master's property, or become accomplices in robbing him or his house of its spiritual privileges or blood-bequeathed liberties. They are not at liberty to transfer their allegiance to a foreign power, to act under his dictation, unless they mean to betray their own sovereign and sacrifice his legitimate influence in his own kingdom. They are bound faithfully and honestly to maintain their master's honor and defend the liberties of his kingdom, until he descend to call them to account. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. His servants cannot conscientiously or consistently serve two masters, or bear faithful allegiance to two sovereigns and supreme heads of the church. Subjection to a foreign power is incompatible with her fidelity to her own Lord, or the integrity of his supremacy over his own house. As a body, she owes subjection to her own head. As a spouse, constancy to her own husband. As a servant, obedience to her own master. As a subject, allegiance to her own sovereign. As a soldier in her militant state, attention to the orders of her own captain and commander. As a vessel, she ought to be regulated by her own helm, and guided by her own sun or morning orb, and not by the lurid star of this world's politics. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be in every thing to their own husbands. The church is a free society, though bound to Christ. Let her therefore manfully maintain that liberty wherewith her head and her husband hath made her free. The coordinate jurisdictions of church and state are mutually distinct and independent. The church has no formal jurisdiction over the state as such, and the state has no formal jurisdiction over the church. The ministers and members of the church are subject to the state in things civil, and the ministers and members of the state, if members of the church, are subject to the spiritual courts in things spiritual. The ministers of religion are more immediately the guardians of faith and judges of doctrine. The ministers of state are more immediately the guardians of law and judges of its violation. It does not belong to the state to prescribe the terms of the church's ministerial or Christian communion, to appoint her offices, to convene her courts, to dictate her constitution or administration in her doctrine, worship, discipline, or government, or exercise an appellate jurisdiction over her censures. As little does it belong to the church to appoint the rulers of the state, convene its courts, enact its laws, and execute their sanctions by assuming the sword. The jurisdictions of both are final. Church and state are each of them supreme in its own sphere, the church in things spiritual and the state in things temporal. The church gives effect to her own laws ecclesiastically, and the state to its civilly. The latter is relatively free to sanction and give civil effort or not to ecclesiastical decisions, and the former is free to approve or not of civil enactments and give them effect ecclesiastically, as in the case of national fasts and thanksgivings. But though the church and state are mutually distinct and independent kingdoms, yet they owe each other mutual duties and may enter into a friendly alliance for their mutual benefit without compromising their independence. And here a footnote. Further than a solemn assertion of the duty of nations to Christ and his church, of the sacred principle of the Christian magistrate's power circa sacra, we cannot enter without interfering with the subject of a separate and distinct lecture in this course. It only belongs to us to show what is not the duty of nations to the church and her head. It belongs to another to show what it is. It is not their duty to rob him of his crown and her of her liberties and spiritual independence, or to render her a mere servile appendage or engine of the state. All depends, however, upon the character of the ally and terms of the alliance. That alliance is bondage, which necessitates the church to act under the direction of an extraneous head. What would the sovereign of Britain think could her subjects no longer act under her authority? What would she think were her ministers compelled to act under the authority of the King of France, and transfer their allegiance to a foreign kingdom? Would she not indignantly ask, who is the sovereign of these realms, Philip or Victoria? The independence of Britain is gone when a foreign power dictates her constitution, controls her administration, nominates her ministers, convenes and prorogues her legislature, cancels or claims an appellate jurisdiction over her decisions. The independence of Turkey is gone when she lays herself at the feet of a foreign power and acts under the dictation of the autocrat of all the Russias. Let those churches that have entered into Erastian alliances renounce the secular advantages, rather than sacrifice the headship of Christ and liberties of his church. If some of them have placed themselves in an illegal position, let them resolutely set themselves to obtain the entire repeal of the civil supremacy within the church and legal revision of the compact if they are determined to cleave to their ancient ally, by whom they have almost all along been enthralled. Let not the subjects of Christ betray their allegiance, or consent to any conspiracy against his crown or kingdom. Let them resist every foreign invasion, rise and defend his royal supremacy, hallowed with blood. To arms, soldiers of Emmanuel, and fight nobly for his sacred jurisdiction. If the men of the world are jealous of any encroachment upon their dominions, ought you to be less of any upon your masters? On, resolute and noble-minded Scotsmen. Bear aloft our Zion's banner, crimsoned o'er with martyrs' blood. It hath waved through lapse of ages, undestroyed by fire or flood. On the field of deadly combat it hath waved aim amid the strife, and our fathers to preserve it perilled fortune, home, and life.